And last presentation of this session is avatar type effects, performance of cognitive tasks in virtual reality. And author is Ye Pen and Anthony Steed. And Anthony will present.
Hello, good afternoon. This talks about something which I think is one of the most fascinating things about virtual reality. We've at a conference where we're all building sort of quite creative worlds where we're a lot of where we've got lots of applications involved, and there's lots of different talks of different ways of using virtual reality. But I'm got increasingly fascinated over the last few years about what it is that we ourselves bring to the virtual reality. In particular, the fact that we have skills and we have attitudes and we have behaviours in the real world, and how are those conveyed in the system. So to some extent, we're looking at the question of whether we go into virtual reality, why asking users to learn new skills, or can they bring in old skills and old behaviours. So this work is focusing on a very specific problem of what you look like inside the virtual reality, and therefore what impact that has on your behaviour, and in particular your behaviour in certain types of cognitive task. So this work is a follow-up to a previous study that we published a few years ago. So we actually ran this about a couple of years ago while Ye Pan was still at UCL. But Ye is now working at Disney with, I think her boss might be in the room. Unfortunately, she can't be here to present this, so I will present. Okay, so the basic question we want to try and dig into is, in a head-mounted display, should there be a self-avatar, and what should it look like? And of course, this is one of the biggest design decisions you get inside a virtual reality system. All of the headset providers, all the toolkits, they provide sort of default avatars that you can use. For example, the ones on the right are an early version of the Oculus avatars, and you can see those in the toy box demonstration, and you can use those or simple variants of those yourself. It's a very specific design decision, though. They're blue and transparent, and some people love them because they sort of hint at sort of futuristic Star Wars-like displays. They look sort of sci-fi. They look like they're from the future, but they're obviously not representative of specific people. It's hard to tell who they are, and in particular in this environment, they're identical. So you can only tell people apart if they talk and wave at you. So the avatar is obviously useful for certain things, like even as a first-person point of view, the reason that we draw the controllers or we draw hands is so you know that they're working, they know they're in front of you, and this is the thing which you're going to interact with the world with. You're going to take your real hand, you're going to move it, some graphics is going to follow that, it's going to hit an object and you can pick it up. So all of that is very important for understanding how the system works, because it's virtual, the virtual objects aren't, you don't get any tactile feedback or from the real world, so you need some sort of representation. We can also see in this demonstration that they're socially useful. Many people play a lot of games, a lot of time now spent in social virtual environments when they have different types of avatar. And people find, even though the vast majority of these are cartoony in style, people found that they're very useful. They get to adopt an avatar, they can role play with it, and it's great fun. So there's lots of evidence that they're socially useful as well. And also, finally, there's in the sort of why should we have one, there's all sorts of wonderful illusions that people have been exploring over the last probably 10 years now, of that you have an avatar in the world, you see a body, and you somehow take on certain aspects of what you see. So, for example, There are various versions of a rubber hand illusion or the virtual arm illusion. You feel as if you look down, you see a hand, you feel as if it's part of your body, to the extent that when you threaten it, your person responds. People have taken that a very long way to showing how people can embody other people's emotions, different races, different genders, and so on. But I'm still interested in the question of what that is actually doing to the person. So are they still able to, are they role-playing, or are they behaving in a way which is consistent with their previous behaviours? So we should say, of course, that avatars have some problems. They get in the way. So this became apparent in a study that we ran a few years ago. If you draw an avatar and you put it in front of the person's virtual eyes, then it obscures the real world. So you can imagine, it obscures the virtual world. So if you put out your hand and you cover things up, there are certain tasks you can imagine and certain tasks that we built where people were slower with an avatar than without an avatar, purely for the reason that if they don't have an avatar, they can see the whole world continuously, and they're floating around as if they're a ghost. So it's possible to construct these tasks, these environments, but again, you look at the top list and go, well, it's still going to do an avatar because it's natural and it automatically going, but it's not obviously always useful. There's also a risk of miscalibration. So as we saw in the previous talk, from limited sensor information, you can make a detailed avatar. But if you're trying to do, say, an elbow with a Vive controller, there's obviously a free degree of freedom. And even then, depending on where you put the tracker on the elbow, it's quite hard to make a whole arm that looks correct. So it's hard to get those right, and if it's miscalibrated, then somebody might have quite unusual reactions. So, for example, a common one that I see in lots of people's demos, including our own, I should admit, is that the arm stretches all the way, and then the hand has to detach a little bit because the arm wasn't calibrated to be quite long enough, and the person is rotating their shoulder. We didn't measure that, so they're doing this, not this. And actually the hand can stretch further than the naive inverse kinematics we designed work. So there's risk of miscalibration. And finally, it's potentially implausible if it doesn't look like the participant. So in other lines of work, which I won't talk about today, we found people struggle to use avatars that don't look like people they know. So there's quite a lot of evidence that some people struggle to use avatars that look like these blue aliens, especially if it's somebody they know and they're expecting a certain attitude or certain set of facial expressions from them. So we had a paper at VRST last year where we talked about that with a sort of longitudinal study run with some of the with the Gear VR system, where people had really struggled to talk to avatars or interact with them because it didn't look like the other person. But potentially also this applies to yourself. So if you look down and see hands that don't look like your own, then it's potentially possible that you might have trouble to interact with them. I don't have any direct evidence for that from an experiment. That's one of the pieces of future work from this study. But it's certainly plausible that and anecdotally I think I have evidence that some people react quite badly to seeing hands that don't look like their own. Okay, so that's the motivation. We came to this particular theme of work from linguistics. So in a previous life, I was a mathematician, and I'm still interested in the teaching of maths. And there's a lot of discussion about this particular phenomena in teaching of especially elementary maths. And there's quite influential paper from Goldin Meadow and colleagues. So the basic premise is that when children and adults, both are covered in this paper, do certain types of calculation, they gesture with their hands. And the outcome, to go to the bottom bullet point, is that the gesturing is not a side effect of thinking about maths. It is the doing of maths. So it's that people gesture to not to sort of signal what they're thinking. It's part of thinking. And in particular, with the study, what they were doing was they're asking children and adults, they were asking either the children or adults, I forget which, to factor quadratic equations. So in a quadratic equation, you have a sequence of 3 numbers, and then you have to split it into 2 bits of smaller factors, right? So everybody remembers that from high school, don't they? And even when I'm doing this, there's a long thing that comes into 2 small things. You can see that I'm mentally shuffling something. And this shuffling is signalled by my hand gestures, but it's actually not me just signalling. It's actually me remembering that I have to take these 3 numbers and come up with 4 numbers that multiply together in the right way. So they'd noticed that people would point at the numbers, and the pointing isn't. One of the things I noticed is that people would point at the numbers, and that the pointing wasn't really just output, it was sort of input. So this number's important now, I need to focus on this one, and I can then derive these ones, for example. Okay, so in their study, they had shown that if somebody can't gesture, they were sort of worse at this task. So that's the key point of this paper, is that they had the children and the adults do this task, moving their hands around, and then they'd also ask them to sit on their hands, so they couldn't move their hands, and then ask them to do the task, and they were worse at it. I'll explain the bit in the middle, remembering letter sentences, in a while, because we're using a very direct derivative of their protocol. Okay, so we had a piece of prior work at IEEE Virtual Reality 2016, the premise of which is almost exactly a copy of that paper, but instead of just having people gesture or not gesture, so this is somebody in head-mounted display, they see an avatar, they can gesture, or they see a self-avatar and they can't gesture. This reproduces almost to the letter the task in that previous paper from 2001. We didn't have people sit on their hands because the hand trackers don't work if you sit on them. So they had just put their hands on their knees, and they were just told not to move them. So that's a reproduction of that previous work, and we also had it done without seeing an avatar either. So, and there are 2 conditions here, one where they could gesture and one where they couldn't gesture. And the short version of the results, here's the long version. The short version is this graph, which basically showed that if you look at the bar on the right, if you have an avatar and you can gesture, you're significantly better at this letter recall task, which I'll explain in a second, than if you have an avatar but can't move it, or you don't have an avatar at all. So this is the reproduction of the study from 2001, just in virtual reality essentially, which sort of proves that result still holds if you've got that an avatar has the same effect as being able to gesture, and this has no self-avatar, sort of is the same as oh sorry, I'm gesturing and you can't see that. So this reproduces the previous paper, and then this is no avatar, and that was really interesting for us. And even more interesting is that when you don't see the avatar, but you can gesture, people don't gesture. So that if they can't see a hand, even though the hand is helping you think, then it's sort of that people don't do it. And that sort of that really emphasises the previous speculation that actually the hand it's important to see it because it's part of thinking. If it's a side effect, it wouldn't really matter if you saw it or not. But it seems to be that its main benefit is that you see it, and you see it happening. Okay, so that was the prior work, and people ask questions about this. And therefore we tried to answer 2 of them in the current work, which is a short paper we're presenting today. The first way we've extended it is that we have a hands-only representation, because that's very common. And there's lots of discussion about can you have body ownership illusion with a hand that stops here? So if you don't see the arm and the shoulder, and I wouldn't want to quote a paper off the top of my head, but it seems to be that some sort of continuity from your torso through your arm is important, at least for some people, for say, the body ownership illusion. And so it's interesting because it's the default to ask, well, if you only have a hand, does that help with the gesture? Is that sufficient for this sort of this gesturing to help with your cognitive load? And then in a real-world benchmark, we had been asked explicitly why we hadn't run a real-world benchmark in the previous study, the answers to which was pass. We didn't really know why we hadn't done it, but it was a sort of an obvious one to ask. So that gets to the question: is the impact of having an avatar or using the virtual reality also high? So compared to the previous study, we had upgraded. The previous one was done with an Oculus DK2, and we upgraded that to a CV1, so they're not exactly the same system. But we had still kept the same tracking system, despite, and it is a point to discuss with anybody who wants to follow up the study. We used a magnetic tracking system because it needs to track above and below a table that's in the lab. And that's a table with very little metal in it. So that a magnetic tracker works. That magnetic tracker's been working for 25 years. Yeah, that's a wonderful tracker. I recommend getting one if anybody's throwing one away, because they still work, unlike our Razor Hydras, which none of them work anymore. Okay, so the current study had 32 participants, 15 female, and there are 4 conditions now. So we've dropped the gesturing or not gesturing. We're just having everybody gesture now. And then there are 4 things. We're having the same 4 conditions. There's no avatar again, because that's the equivalent to all the low conditions in the previous study. We have hands only. We have a full avatar, and then we have a real situation where the person still wears the trackers, although they don't wear a head-mounted display. We and ahed about doing it to see-through augmented reality, video see-through augmented reality, but decided against in the end. So that is a limitation. Okay, so the procedure is given in this slide, but we can all do it together. So I'll just go through and explain with the timings, and it's a hard task. So pay attention. Okay, so you have 15 seconds to memorize these 8 letters. Okay. You have 15 seconds to decide which of the 2 lower figures are rotated versions of the upper one. Won't shout out loud. We'll shout out loud in a second. Which 2 is it? It's A and B. All right. Okay. All right. Now, tell me the 8 letters. Now that's the hard bit, right? So that is actually quite hard, and the 8 letters is chosen so that it's hard. So if you reproduce it, when it was previously done for school children, it was 6 letters. For university students, it's 8 letters. If you're going to run it with any other population, I suggest piloting that bit carefully. Because it is supposed to be hard. Because our average result on that is only 60%. We give you points for any number of letters. You don't have to get them all correct. It's a count of how many letters correct that you get. Okay, so the basic way this works, to tie it back to the beginning, is that this is the bit which is cognitively difficult. This is, but it's not the main focus, right? So this is. Rotation is a standard set of It's a standard mental rotation exercise. It's not the same as the maths question because we didn't want to do maths in a head-mounted display with where the focus is very much on text reading and reading of small numbers. But the difficult task is this one, and this is where the results are found. It's basically, if you can do this well, it doesn't interfere with your doing this task. So the harder you find the spatial rotation, the worse you will perform at this recall task. Okay. So the data we collect is then the scoring of the letter recall, the scoring of the spatial, which is the proportion of letters correctly recalled, the scoring of the spatial task, which is the proportion of figures matched correctly, and then an important count, which is the count of the number of times the experimenter observed a gesture being made. So the results are easy to explain. The letter recall is completely explained by this graph, where full avatar and real are significantly different than no avatar. So part of that, the difference, and the reason they're on the left, this reproduces the 2016 paper, and there's no different from the real situation. So that's interesting. It's not obviously not proving there's not a difference, but the levels are completely consistent. And unfortunately, from a statistics point of view, hands only is not different from anything. Okay, so it's not different from 0, and it's not different from these two either. Okay, so that's difficult to interpret. And then the mental rotation is that as before, there's no difference across these, but that is actually expected. There's a bit more variance in the full avatar one and the hands-only one, which I'll explain, which may hint at what an explanation is. And then an important part is how often gestures occur. So in total, there are, for each condition, there are 8 users. Each user does 20 of those letter and spatial rotation tasks. There's 160 trials in total for each one. And you'll see that in the full and real conditions, everybody gestures all the time. Okay, so that means they move their hands in a way which isn't scratching their nose or moving the head-mounted display up and down. It's just a tick on a box done by the experimenter. When they don't have hands, so there's no avatar, they gesture very little. And that's again similar to what we found previously. If you can't see your hands, sometimes people start by moving their hands around. And one of the common things you see, for example, when they're doing the rotation task is they literally rotate it with their hands. They mimic the rotation that would be required to do the task. So sometimes people start and then stop, and sometimes people don't do it at all. And then this is solidly in the middle. Some people with their hands gesture a lot and some people don't. So this suggests to me a sort of individual difference between certain users. Okay, so to conclude, the results validate the prior results. The real and full body avatar's performance on the memory task is significantly better than avatar, though the hands only is not significantly different than either of these, which is really interesting. But the results on gesture occurrences strongly suggest that there's actually an individual difference between the users and their attitude towards the hands-only avatars. So that then leads to the following questions, which we'd be delighted to collaborate. UPAN has now left, so we'd be delighted to collaborate with you lot on how do you model the hand, how much detail is required. I'm also interested in what sort of tasks this expands to, because these are tasks where you don't need, and you can do on a piece of paper, so you don't need your hands. That's why we chose them. They're not interactive at all. We can do it on the screen. So how far does that go? Does it go to sort of manipulation tasks and so on? And then finally, is it the same for all users? Because I have a strong suspicion that avatars and self-avatars aren't working for some of our target user population. Okay, thanks.
Questions?
It's more like an experimental design question. Like, did you match the avatar skin color to the participant skin color?
No, we didn't. No. It's a good question. We had male and female avatars, and yes, no, we didn't match the skin color. It's something that people do mention occasionally, but it's an obvious. It's on this list of how, if we could model you exactly, what impact would that have? Yeah.
It may be the related question. So participants choose their avatar or randomly selected?
No, so we only have male and female ones. Yeah, I mean we choose that. Yeah.
Very interesting study. I can't quite put the finger on it, but what or where do you think gesturing comes into play in this memory task? Is it like the learning or the retention? And
yeah, so one of the things we haven't done is motion captured replayed the motion and looked for specific gestures. I can tell you types of gesture people do. That when people do this task, sometimes you see them pairing things up. So, and marshalling, going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then when they have to recall, going 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? One of the things you see people doing here is this gesture, and also remember it's on a table, so they see it. They see their hand. Sorry, if I go. They see this, right? So when you're doing the answers, you can cover up the ones you know aren't true. So that is really interesting. That if somebody knows it's not C, they can put their hand over C, and therefore they don't have to consider it anymore. So maybe that's just offloading. That's a direct offload of knowledge into the world through your hand. It's not that one or that one. So I think it had more impact in the rotation task, and it's offloading some of the tasks, some of either the recall, sort of just the matching, or the actually help you. So you do see a lot of people literally doing this with their hands when they're trying to helping themselves rotate the thing. So I think it has more impact there, but I do think it does have some impact on the letter recall as well. Sorry, I'll just put that back up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I did wonder as well, because to me it would also be more like an offloading with the rotation task. So have you done it with a different task in between?
No, we haven't, and that's no, we haven't. It's a good question. That was behind that one at the end, saying what sort of task does this offload to? Is it ones where there is an obvious gesturing metaphor, and that could include manipulation, or if we could find one which was a spatial, something which was. Yeah, I have lots of theories, right, and they're all to do with this. There's an embodied cognition, and how people structure workspaces around themselves. So I think you'll find it in a lot of different situations, but these are situations where you have ability to customize the environment, which isn't true of most games, if you see what I mean. But I'm happy to discuss it afterwards. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the nice experiment. Well, in either this work or previous works you cited, have you tested the quality or degree of body ownership of the subjects? And does the ownership sort of correlate with performance in any way?
No, we haven't. We have done other work on body ownership, but no, we haven't done a study that's correlated the two. No, we haven't. It's a good question. We chose not to do an ownership induction in this one. Sort of tactile. The most common body ownership illusions are done through tactile induction. You tap the person at the same time as their avatar. We in this one we wanted to set it up as if it were a real consumer VR system with the choices you would make there, where those types of induction aren't done or would be impossible. So that was a choice, but it would be fascinating to see if you did induce an ownership illusion, would it change their attitude, their performance on the task?
Right. In particular, the performance in hands-only condition, the performance is not, it's
Yes,
in the middle. So maybe the body ownership was not good enough there. So it may
Absolutely. That's my suspicion as well, is that people are struggling to use the hand. There's really, everybody knows that there's a really odd aspect of the hands, which is you see the end of them. And it's just visually confusing because you don't see that anywhere else. So possibly even the perception of orientation is wrong with the hands only. But yes, it could be that they can't own. That I feel that the body ownership isn't. But there's a lot to unpick there. I'm sure it'll be fascinating to look at. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you already answered this, but for the no hands and the hands only, where only a certain number of people gestured, did you do any analysis on if they gestured and got it right? Like, was there a relationship between doing the gesturing and a correct answer?
Yes, I have to admit that we made a mistake and we didn't actually. The scoring was just on a piece of paper, so we couldn't match it to the tracking. So yeah, it's fascinating. It was a great question, and I'm afraid I can't answer it. And that's just a mistake in the protocol, which we'll fix next time. Yeah, we'll see. When I have more students, please send me your students. Yeah.
Any other question? Yeah, then let's thanks all the author of these sessions, and then let's conclude this session.